All right, for decades, pretty much our whole lives, we've been told one thing. Saturated fat is bad for you. That it's the fast track to a heart attack and a spare tire. But what if that's not the whole story? What if that advice is built on some pretty shaky science? Today, we're going to deconstruct one of the biggest nutritional dogmas of our time.
And we start with a really bold, really provocative claim from science journalist Nina Teicholz. She says, "We have been lied to." Now, this isn't just a casual statement. She spent nearly a decade digging through the science, the history, all of it. And her conclusion is that making enemies out of fats, the stuff in red meat and butter, was a huge mistake.
So, that's the big question we're tackling in this explainer. Is saturated fat really the enemy we've been told it is? We're going to dive into the evidence, as presented by our source material, to understand the case against saturated fat. It's a bit of a rabbit hole, so let's get into it. Okay, first up, let's start by taking on the three biggest claims against red meat and saturated fat head-on. We'll look at what the common belief is and then see how our sources poke holes in it. Now, before we go any further, there's this one super important idea we have to get our heads around. It's called confounding variables. Sounds technical, but it's simple. Think of them as hidden factors. A lot of nutrition science can only show that two things are linked, not that one causes the other. So, for example, are people who eat more red meat getting sick because of the meat, or is it because they're also more likely to smoke or drink soda or skip the gym? The source argues that these hidden factors create a totally false connection. So let's apply that to the first big myth, heart disease. The source's argument here is crucial. They say we basically blame the hamburger patty for the sins of the entire meal. The sugary soda, the highly refined white bun, the fries cooked in industrial oils. The real gold standard of science, randomized clinical trials, have apparently failed, again and again, to prove that saturated fat itself is the culprit behind heart disease.
And what about cancer? This was a huge deal back in 2015. The World Health Organization made massive headlines saying, red meat probably causes cancer. But the source material here points out that the panel that made this call, well, they allegedly left out clinical trials that showed no link at all. And the risk they did find? It was a relative risk of 1.17. To put that in perspective, 1.0 means zero risk. A lot of scientists don't even take a risk seriously unless it's over 2.0. So the source argues this was a statistically tiny finding that got blown way out of proportion.
Okay, this next one goes against everything we've heard. The idea that fat makes you fat. It seems like simple math, right? Fat has more calories. But the argument here isn't about calories, it's about hormones, specifically the fat storage hormone insulin. And what triggers a big insulin response? It's not fat, it's glucose, which comes from carbohydrates. The source argues that it's the sugars and the starches that are telling your body to store fat. So if the evidence is so weak, how on earth did this anti-fat message become the dominant belief for like 60 years? Well, to understand that, we have to go back in time.
It all really kicks off in the 1950s. The country was in a panic over a huge spike in heart attacks. A scientist named Ancel Keys came along and really pushed his theory that dietary fat was the bad guy. And he was persuasive. By 1961, he'd helped convince the American Heart Association to issue its first ever guidelines against saturated fat. Then came the big one. In 1980, the U.S. government made it official, telling the whole country to cut back on fat and load up on things like bread, pasta, and cereal.
And according to the source, this chart shows exactly what happened next. Before those 1980 guidelines, the adult obesity rate in the U.S. was pretty stable, right around 13%. But look what happens after. It just skyrockets, climbing all the way up to over 42% today. The source argues this isn't just some coincidence. It's a direct consequence of telling people to swap fats for carbs. Okay, so if the old way of thinking is flawed, what's the alternative? What does this new paradigm for eating and health actually look like? Let's check it out.
The main idea here is something called carbohydrate intolerance. It's a really helpful way to think about it. You know how some people are lactose intolerant? The source suggests that many of us, after decades of high-carb diets, have basically become intolerant to carbs. Our bodies just can't handle all the sugar anymore.
And here's the step-by-step of how that happens. You eat a lot of carbs, and yeah, that includes so-called healthy whole grains that still break down into sugar. This causes constant spikes in your blood sugar. Your body, doing its job, pumps out insulin to deal with all that sugar. But over time, your cells get tired of hearing that signal. They become resistant. So your body has to shout louder, producing even more insulin. And that vicious cycle, according to the source, is what leads to obesity, type 2 diabetes, and even heart disease. So what does this way of eating look like? While the source argues for a return to traditional stable fats, we're talking about animal fats like butter, lard, and tallow for cooking. Why? Because their chemical structure is stable, so they don't break down and oxidize under high heat. And things like olive oil are fantastic, but better for cold uses, like on a salad. Now, when you stack up the different diets and look at the clinical trial data through the lens of our source, a really interesting picture starts to form. The low-fat diet, the one we were told to follow for decades, has apparently failed in major trials to show any real benefit for heart disease, cancer, or weight loss. The Mediterranean diet is better, for sure, but some reviews show it gets outperformed by low-carb diets. And that brings us to low-carb and keto, which the source claims have a mountain of evidence supporting them for actually improving and even reversing these chronic metabolic diseases. And all this information kind of brings us to this final point from Nina Teicholz. At the end of the day, with all the conflicting advice out there, your own body is its own laboratory. We are all an N-of-1 experiment. The argument is, why not try a different approach for yourself? And just see how you feel. And really, that leaves us all with this final, crucial question. When the official advice doesn't seem to line up with our public health results, and there's all this counter-evidence piling up, how do you figure out the right path for yourself? It's a tough question, for sure, but figuring it out is probably one of the most important things we can do for our own health.